Hey everyone, and welcome back. In today's video I'm doing a mixed media project, and I'm doing a mixed media collage painting type project, and I'm working on a piece of wood chipboard. And this video is going to be a little bit different to my normal videos. Normally I do real-time tutorial type videos, but this video I've sped up by about 500% because this project took me several hours to do, and it was becoming impossible in order for me to talk and do it at the same time, because I hadn't made, normally when I do my tutorial videos I've made a test of the tutorial first so that I can show you what I'm doing quickly, but because this is a one-off, I couldn't make a test, so that's why I'm doing a voiceover, and I've sped it up, so I hope you guys enjoy it, even though it's not a real-time tutorial. So this piece was inspired by Jane Austen, and I created it partly for a blog challenge. One of the scrapbooking stores that I shop with, they had a challenge on their blog, and I decided to enter it. And this was a piece that I'd wanted to do for a while, and it fitted their theme. And the theme that they were doing for their challenge was a woman that inspires you. And Jane Austen has always been an inspiration for me. I absolutely love her books, and I always find her writing style, her life, very inspiring. So I very much had been wanting to do a Jane Austen piece for a long time, and it was just the right sort of time, and it fitted with the theme for the challenge, so I could enter and have a lot of fun making this piece. And so what I started out with a piece of wood, a piece of chipboard, and it was a nice sort of oval, a nice oval shape. And I've actually had this piece of wood in my stash, in a drawer, for about a year. I think it's exactly a year. I bought it at a craft fair a year ago, and it's been sitting in my drawer waiting for the perfect project. And the moment I started planning this and thinking about this piece, I knew I'd finally found the perfect project. After a whole year of sitting in my stash, I'd found the exact thing to use it for. So I started out with some white acrylic gesso. I primed the wood. I was using the PBO brand, and then I took some scrapbooking paper, and I just covered the background. And as you saw, I was using the 6x6 inch pieces because that's what I had, and I had to overlap a little bit in order to cover the whole frame, but that didn't really make any difference because once the ink's on there and the texture paste, you're not going to see anything. And the paper that I used was from the Transatlantic travel set. I got it back in the summer, so it may not be available anymore, but it has some really nice vintage text and sort of travel stickers and things like that in it. And then I had this nice printout picture of Jane Austen, and I went onto Google Images and I typed in Jane Austen portrait. I believe there's only one known portrait of Jane Austen currently, and this one is based off the sketch of her that her sister did. Her sister Cassandra sketched her, and that's what most of the modern portraits of Jane Austen are based of. And this is not the original sketch. The original one, I saw a picture of it, but it wasn't high enough resolution to print out. So I also wanted it in sepia grey tones kind of colours, and so this one fitted really nicely, and it's a really nice image as well, so it fitted my colour scheme. And for the colours I went for blue, brown and white, so it has a vintage soft feel to it. And then after I had glued I ripped out Jane. Instead of cutting her, I sort of ripped around the paper to give it a slightly more vintage, not vintage, but a sort of more distressed look. And then I used my distress inks. I'm a little bit behind the motion in the voiceover, as I'm sure you can tell, but I used my distress inks. I did a lot of blending with them. And I've used frayed burlap and faded jeans, and then I put on some texture paste using a stencil from Kaiser Craft, and the stencil is called Blossom, and I just used an old gift card to smush the texture paste through the stencil. And an interesting thing happened with the distress inks as I was working on this. Now, I am drying the piece in between layers. I'm using my heat gun. You can kind of half see it every now and then off camera. The lead's not quite long enough to stretch all the way over my table, so that's why I don't have it directly on camera. But an interesting thing happened was that the Distress Oxides, in order to get the oxide look, you have to spritz the oxide, the inks with water. But I was finding that after I'd laid them down, they began to get that oxide look, even without me spritzing the water on them. They were almost sort of self-oxidizing, if that makes any sense. So I thought that was quite interesting. Obviously, it's not the complete full effect, but it was beginning to change. You know, with these distress inks, if you spray them with water, they kind of change colour a little bit, and they get slightly lighter as they dry. But I think that the gesso was slightly damp underneath. It wasn't completely dry, so it was slightly reacting. The dampness in the gesso was slightly reacting the inks that I was putting on top. So that created quite an interesting effect. And then I took another stencil from Kaisercraft. This one's Rising Bubbles. It's one of my favourite stencils. I use it in almost every project. And I just created some, just a bit more texture with the white gesso. And I really like using gesso through stencils because it's not opaque. So, and it will dry slightly transparent. So you'll pick up a lot of the colour that's underneath it. And what I can do is I can put a very subtle stencil without it becoming overpowering and without it being opaque white, and I really like that look. So now, once everything was dry, I could move on to this is the bit that I most enjoyed. I enjoyed the whole process, but this is the bit that I had been imagining, and when I first thought about doing this piece, this is the thing that I most wanted to do. And I had these fabric flowers. I think they're fabric, and they're little wire fabric flowers, and I wanted to use them on a project. And so they were all in white, and I have some that are in clusters and some that are buds. And with the clusters, I just took my blue sponge, and I didn't, as you can see, I just used the sponge. I didn't put it in any more ink. I just rubbed the sponge over the top of the flowers, just to kind of give the edges of all the petals a sort of a blue tint to help tighten a bit more, and it looked really nice. I really like how that looked. And I'm using my nail clippers to trim down the wire stems of these flowers, and I'm just sort of clustering them together, coming down the side of the frame. And I just think it looked really nice, and it really added to the floral. I have quite a feminine floral theme going on. Not that florals necessarily are feminine, but I was going for a very gentle feeling, so that's why I had the blue and the flowers and these sorts of paper flowers, fabric flowers. I don't know why I keep thinking they're paper. Have a vintage feel to them anyway, and I was trying to, as I arranged them down the edge of the frame, I was sort of putting the flowers one over another, so that each would hide the stems of the other one, so that they're really bunched and clustered. And I'm using the hot glue because I found that worked the best. Now my hot glue is not very hot. It's a very small little glue gun, so it doesn't get very hot, and I can easily touch the glue as it's coming out. It's really not that hot. And so what I did next was I had some pearl beads, some big pearl beads, and I just dabbed a tiny bit of hot glue onto the end of each of the beads and dropped them into the flower cluster to add a little bit more of a sparkle and to add some more dimension. And I find sometimes when I'm arranging things in clusters or putting embellishments on, often it's good to work in odd numbers. So I had two different types of flowers and the beads in that cluster, so that made an odd number, and I found that looked very good. And you'll see me playing around a lot with that ribbon. And the ribbon took me an awful long time to figure out what to do with it. And in the end, I had to set it aside for a bit, and I added in, I wasn't quite sure what to add in. I almost wanted to add a sentiment, not a quote from Jane Austen, but I thought that too much text would clutter the piece. So I ended up just adding Jane. And I'm using Tim Holtz's Ideology stickers, and these are the silver edge stickers, and they're really nice because they come in white and black, but the edges are just they're edged with silver, and you can also get them edged with gold, but it adds a nice little sort of shadow to the piece. And I really like that kind of subtle, gentle look. Again, it just ties in with the whole the whole colour scheme of the piece. And then I finally got to adding in that ribbon. I went ahead just before I did that and I sort of darkened up some of the edges, and I don't like to get too dark too early on when I'm working on these pieces. It's because you can't go lighter really, you have to go light and then dark, and so it's easier to see if you need to go darker afterwards rather than go too dark in the beginning and think you need to be lighter afterwards. So I glued it down on the bottom at the start, but I didn't like that. I felt it was too heavy at the bottom, and then I was trying to glue it on the top. That ribbon, I was playing around with that ribbon for ages and I really wanted to use it, so I ended up cutting the tails off the embellishment and I ended up gluing it down on the stems of the flowers, so as if the flowers are being held together with the ribbon, and that ended up looking really nice. But sometimes you just have to play around with something for a long time before you can kind of get it in a place that you feel looks really nice. And this is another reason why this sort of project is a little bit more difficult to teach in real time, because I would just be playing around with that ribbon for ages and it would get very boring to watch. Right, so that's the piece finished. I'm really pleased with how it turned out. It had the exact soft vintage look that I was going for, and it was a really fun project to work on. So anyway, make sure you leave any questions that you have down in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them, and I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you again next time.